Einstein once said, "If you can't explain a thing simply, you don't understand it well enough." What this leaves out is that explaining and understanding are actually two entirely different skill sets. The fact that those who actually study things for a living tend to be autistic nerds with the consequent social acumen of a faulty alarm clock is why science communicator is actually a legitimate job title and not just another DEI dumping ground for communications majors. But all that aside, my compulsive need to decode things that probably weren't actually coded to start, combined with my intimate fascination with both science and esoterica, makes this my ideal hunting grounds. However, since I'm hardly the biggest fish in this pond, let me come clean about something right up front. Though I've had a Minecraft account for about as long as the game's been around, my actual experience for almost all of that duration has been almost exclusively as a meditative window. Basically, I like to putz around in creative mode to let my brain cool down after work, and only very recently have I begun to reach my branches into the actual game mechanics of this video game title. Also, I'm both morally and intellectually obligated to shout out MatPat and Retro Gaming's lore series, since without them, I'd have almost no soil in which to plant the seeds of my own theories. Speaking of, I believe it was either Yuri Kalashnikov or Steve Jobs who once said that making something complex is easy, making something simple that also works is extremely difficult. And it was Lao Tzu who said in the Tao Te Ching that the skilled carver carves little. This is true in all works of man, just as it is true in nature. In the long run, nature selects for the simplest solution to the greatest number of problems. This is why some of the most enduring specimens in all of media history are those which were forced to plunder the maximum amount of value possible out of the fewest resources. Some of the most familiar and long-lived examples of which include Dungeons and Dragons, Roblox, Skyrim, The Sims, and of course, the subject of today's video, whose whole identity was so compact and self-explanatory that it's not only the game's title, but has become the poster child of what most people refer to as the open-world sandbox genre, but which I personally prefer to call toolbox games, since their vanilla forms are little more than a versatile set of tools and a workbench of sorts, which afford players room to both build and maneuver as much or as little as they alone choose. Something else you'll note is that all of them rely heavily or wholly on user-generated content to maintain their relevancy. In short, what made Minecraft the blowout success that it was, in my opinion, was its expertly calculated recipe of fractal complexity and the suggestive environmental storytelling that keeps games like Dark Souls and Hollow Knight on the popular radar long after the novelty of their mechanics or aesthetic wears off. Now, I tell you all of this because if we're to decode the logic of Minecraft's mechanics and world order, a key component in that effort is to understand the mind of God, as it were. While the phrase "made for children" has effectively become the newer, passive-aggressive way of saying a thing is lowbrow or unsophisticated, it is a factually correct statement to make about Minecraft, as it was explicitly designed to be accessible to kids, specifically within the demographic of 8 to 13-year-olds. This is important because this is the age when typically children are just starting to develop their essential awareness and reasoning skills, that we start beginning to process the world around us rather than simply absorbing information fed to us by our elders. It is here that we begin to learn our rudimentary problem-solving and deductive pattern seeking to diagnose a problem and engineer a solution, all of which are invaluable skills when you're dropped cold into an unfamiliar world with empty hands, facing a blank horizon with no instructions or objectives. This in mind, we can start by leaving at the door any and all notions of obsequious or eldritch magispheres such as the Conjunction, the Cosmere, or even the Force or Immaterium. In order to get the maximal amount of blood from this stone, we need to think more along the lines of My Little Pony than Soulsborne, which, if you're not brand new around here, you'll know isn't really my style. However, as hopefully that long-winded intro should have made plain, simple is not synonymous with stupid. To quote a talking frog that's also a lawyer, long story, from the Discworld novel I Shall Wear Midnight, the sun is simple, a sword is simple, a storm is simple. Behind everything simple is a huge tale of complicated, and that huge tale is what this video is, hopefully, going to be here to unravel. But in order to do that, I first need to get you acquainted with the basic rudiments of color theory. For anyone who wasn't an AP art student like myself, the most fundamental concept is that of the color wheel. Up top, you have your primaries, red, blue, and yellow, and secondaries, orange, green, and purple, the latter of which are combinations of the former. Below that are your tertiary and quaternary colors, which are all just increasingly subtle gradations and shades of the first two categories. Next on my autistic rubric is Plutchik's theory that humans are naturally predisposed to attribute certain actions and emotions to certain colors. For example, the color red usually has the associations of anger and aggression, but also of hunger. This is because it's the color of blood, but also of fresh meat and certain fruits like apples and cherries. Meanwhile, light blue is the color of peace and tranquility, while dark blue is typically associated with sadness and gloom. Purple tends to be the default color of both royalty and, more recently, unearthly magics. I suspect this is probably because instances of true deep purple almost never appear in nature apart from a few sparse species of plants, butterflies, and gemstones. As for why that's the case, the best explanation I could find is that since plants want to absorb as much solar energy as possible, it wouldn't make sense for them to evolve to reflect the highest energy portion of the visible spectrum. But I should point out that this explanation comes from a forum on Reddit called r/tellmelikeim5, so take it with a gunpowder plot's worth of salt. But in any case, the real fulcrum of my thesis is the idea that most magic systems, both from historical myths and in modern fantasy, are built primarily out of humanistic vibes as opposed to well-regimented mechanical principles. And if the internal, child-accessible logic of Minecraft follows the sympathetic color formula I've just described, rather than having to infer bounds of novel esoterica, we can use our own inbuilt intuition and a common-sense understanding of evolutionary psychology to work out the basics. Then from there, we can reverse engineer the underlying story out of the still present mechanics. In less cryptic verbiage, to understand the lore of Minecraft, we first need to know just how its world orders itself. Then we can transitively apply these principles back through the skeins of time to work out just how it got from A to R, alpha to release. Hint, that is an example of what we in the writing profession like to call unsubtle foreshadowing. All right, enough preamble. I'm assuming you have eyes and can read, so I'll just keep this chart on screen for a visual aid. But the general idea is that colors in Minecraft correspond to the elemental substances, most of which are fairly rudimentary stuff nowadays that shouldn't be revolutionary to anyone who's watched the last Airbender cartoon or played literally any game with an elemental magic system. However, the ones I want to specifically focus on for this video are the 6 primary and secondary colors I mentioned at the beginning, namely red, light, and dark blue. Yes, the difference is important: green, gold, pink, and purple, and the grayscale, specifically black, gray, and silver. Now, simple pattern recognition reveals that all forms of magic in Minecraft rely on at least one of 2 energy sources, heat and souls, or, as I'm going to go forward calling them, mechanical and spiritual energy, both of which feed into each other in a perpetual cycle. You see, like I said, Minecraft's a lot like D&D. It's not an art house, it's a tool shed. Apart from a few interesting mobs or mechanics, nothing it does can't or hasn't been done by somebody else somewhere else. But the way it uses what it has is what gives it its legendary staying power. So how exactly does Minecraft use magic? Quite simply, just like every other creation story you've ever heard, all things started off in the void. But then there came the Nether, whose fires produced heat, which, much like the Big Bang, saw the universe start expanding. Eventually, this expansion reached a tipping point at which there begot an equilibrium of sorts. For the first time, the raging fires met the stagnant void, and from their union was birthed all the commonly known mystical elements: light, dark, hot, cold, earth, water, air, metal, and ether, or magic. Now, what do we notice about these elements? 2 things. 1, they correspond to the primary or secondary palette according to the order in which they were conceived. For example, life is signified by green and brown, the former being a mix of blue water and yellow light, and the latter being a combination of green life and red heat. But where do things like the End and Endermen, zombies, and skeletons, etc. fit into all of this? Good question. Let us now visit the other half of our magical dichotomy, spiritual energy, or souls. To briefly define a soul, it's the idiosyncratic patterns that make an autonomous being unique, both from their fellow sentients and from the lower life forms. Edit, normally I would put the word lower in quotations, but considering that the player is the only being in Minecraft who isn't being driven around by RNGesus, on this occasion I've chosen to let it stand on business. This is where the distinction I made between dark and light blue comes in. If you look at the color of the souls found trapped within soul sand, as well as the color of all the things we know are powered by soul energy, from soul lanterns to soul fire to even the beacons and recovery compass, you'll notice a consistent theme in their color palettes. Specifically, they're all either light blue or silver, which is also the color of the moon. This gives rise to my next postulate that spiritual essence comes from the moon, which came from the waters, and that mechanical energy comes from the sun, which came out of the nether. Now, try to stick with me for this part. Light blue is a mix between blue and white. Silver is a combination of light blue and gray, which is a mix of white and black. Black, according to this chart, stands for entropy, void, mystery, and ultimate conclusions, whereas white stands for creation, truth, and ultimate beginnings. And, of course, purple, the color of disorder and of magic, is a combination of red and blue, of primal heat and deep waters. Again, I refer you to literally any other magic or creation story to fill in the blanks on this chart for yourself. And when all is said and done, all of this explains why the player's exclusive ability to respawn in a bed is in fact 100% canonical, why the alpha players were the ancient builders of the various vanilla world structures all along, and why we are the most critical piece of this whole puzzle. We are the hub of the wheel, so to call it. We're the nexus anchor, the fulcrum between light and darkness, life and death, chaos and order, etc., etc. We're the mad dreamer, the maker, and the destroyer. My main bits of evidence for this are that it is we alone who can construct the Wither or slay the Ender Dragon, that the recovery compass, which drops naturally in the world, can only locate the site of the holder's own death, and the existence of beds in the trial chambers, which seem purpose-placed for respawning rather than sleeping. Also, consider that all villages have beds while woodland mansions don't, despite the Illagers being notably more advanced in every way. In conclusion, the moral of this story is that under no circumstances should you ever combine NyQuil with Tylenol. Next thing you know, you'll swear you can literally taste rainbows, and your shit smells of candy corn and gumdrops. Long story short, I don't recommend it. And I also couldn't possibly put into words how much I don't recommend trying to read philosophy books when you're drifting in and out of Neverland like Tinkerbell after a Saturday night bender. Basically, my point is that I'm going to have to make a whole series out of this if I don't want people to start thinking I've come down with whatever the human equivalent of AI rampancy is. Oh, who am I kidding? We all know I've evil Knieveled that abyssal chasm eons ago. Like I said at the start, Minecraft's the digital equivalent of a coloring book, or, a pallet of bricks and a bucket of grout. It's all you really need to uphold a generation of gamers, and that's all it ever really set out to be. So before I go getting myself lost in the dark woods on a moonless night looking for a black cat that was never there to be found, remember to like the video and subscribe if you're as cracked in the skull as me, or if my early onsetting dementia amuses you. And of course, don't forget to check out all the extra bits of my own deep lore at the links in the description. Throw me a bone if you're so inclined. And until next time, my friends, as always, stay safe, stay sane, and always remember, life's too short to take seriously. Peace be ever upon you.